Okay, welcome to week one. This is just going to be a short introduction lecture. I just want to cover some of the key concepts that we'll be talking about this week. Mostly we'll be focusing on chapter one, just so you have a good understanding of the criminal justice system, its components, and this whole idea as to whether or not people believe that the criminal justice system is in fact a system. Okay. So, first of all, it's important to understand that the criminal justice system is often tasked with balancing individual rights versus public order. In other words, the need to make sure that as we enforce crime, public order is crime control, as we try to control crime, we're also at the same time making sure that your individual rights are being attended to. So, for example, part of crime control might be arresting violators. Part of the due process aspect or individual rights is making sure that if I ask you any questions, that I Mirandize you and that you give a statement that is knowing, freely, and voluntary. All right, so the criminal justice system is often trying to make sure this balance takes place. So there's a series of checks and balances that occur within the criminal justice system. To make sure, for example, that your individual rights have in fact been followed by the police after your arrest. If not, then you have remedies, and the criminal justice system is designed to ensure that those checks and balances are adhered to as best as possible. All right, so just know that we're often tasked with challenging this individual rights versus public order. The need for crime control to maintain peace and social order in our society, with the idea that each of us has individual rights, the due process element, which we'll talk about later. Okay, so those are two key things that we have to understand as we begin to try to become more familiar with this concept known as the criminal justice system. So again, criminal justice system is an institution of social control. As a result, criminal justice is caught in the balancing act between these two issues that we've already talked about. All right, so you can take a look here. Individual rights is often referred to as a due process model, and public order is often referred to as a crime control model. So the textbook talks about these two types of models that are used in trying to explain the criminal justice system. And both of them are actually used quite frequently. So, for example, the crime control model is designed, oftentimes is used when we're dealing with low-level misdemeanor type offenses. So, for example, if you were to go to any courtroom, the misdemeanor calendar is full of cases. And that's often crime control model. In other words, it's trying to get these cases through the system as quickly and efficiently as we possibly can. All right, so oftentimes using the crime control model in public order, these type of cases tend to deal with plea bargains, whereas the individual rights type cases tend to be more serious type offenses. So, for example, felonies, where you're looking at extended prison time, you will find that attorneys will file a lot more motions in terms of trying to ensure that their client is afforded all the due process rights as possible. And then you may think that this may not be fair, but in actuality, most public order crimes, crime control model, do not result in a whole lot of jail time, if any. Generally, it's maybe time served, and the person might be placed on some level of probation. So their civil liberties are at less risk than, for example, somebody who has committed a felony, who would most likely be following the due process model. Okay, and that's just my take on it. I mean, when you look at a misdemeanor court, the number of cases is phenomenal that goes through there every day, and it cannot be clogged. If everyone wanted to have their quote day in court, end of quote, the system would shut down. So we do tend to utilize these two models, but oftentimes I think we use those in terms of the more serious crimes versus the less serious crime. That doesn't mean that I can violate your rights if you're only committing misdemeanor. It just means that the consequences in the courts aren't as significant because you're probably going to do jail time or probation, and you're not going to be in prison for 10, 15, 20 years. Okay? But we still follow both of these types of crime control models. So the book talks about these, but that's just my take on how these are actually seen in the court system. These two perspectives also are divided by models of the justice system. So again, each of these models lends important insight into the philosophies of which the criminal justice system is based, especially here in America. And so again, misdemeanors tend to be more of a assembly line justice. Okay, we put everybody on the assembly line, and we go through and we get rid of them. Whereas when we talk about more serious crimes, we're talking about the due process model. It's more of a series of hurdles that one has to go through in order to ensure that a person's rights and liberties have been adhered to before he or she goes off to some level of extended prison time. In terms of the structure of the criminal justice system, we have what's known as a dual court system here in the United States. Basically, we have the federal court system, and then we have the state and local government. So we have state courts. So we have a dual court system, two courts, federal courts and state courts, which is included in local government. Our police courts and corrections are also part of this picket fence. We have, for example, at the local level, we have county jails. At the state level, we have state prisons. At the federal level, we have federal prisons, all right? In terms of police, at the federal system, we have agencies such as the FBI, United States Marshal Service, alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. At the state level, we tend to have state police or highway patrols, things to that effect. At the local level, we tend to have police and sheriffs. In terms of courts, we have a federal court system. We have district courts, we have courts of appeals, and we have United States Supreme Court. State courts tend to have the same thing. We have three tiers. We have a local court, we have an appellate court, and states have a Supreme Court. At the local level, we have our trial courts, okay? So they're tied to the state courts, but they're often at the local level, county courts, so to speak, but they're all overseen by the state. In corrections, we have federal corrections, we have federal probation. State courts, or state corrections, we have the penal institutions, parole. At the local level, corrections is going to be jail, maybe probation, maybe some level of parole, depends on how your state is structured. So we have a tiered system. So we have police at all three levels, we have courts at all three levels, and we have corrections at all three levels. So it sort of adds to a complication of our criminal justice system, which is why we have, theoretically over 20,000 local law enforcement agencies because of this tiered system that we have, and that's the way our founding fathers have wished to establish our criminal justice system. Our criminal justice system consists of three core groups: police, courts, and corrections. Okay, police, courts, and corrections. And so you go through this sequence of events. Police arrest somebody, the court adjudicates the case. If he or she is found guilty, corrections is tasked with rehabilitation and punishment and so forth. So let's take a look at the police. What do they do? Well, police enforce the laws, specific laws, whether they be state law, local ordinance, those type of things. They investigate crimes. They search people, they stop people, they search buildings, they search areas, they arrest, they detain people, they maintain social order through the order maintenance process, right? So the police are probably the most visible element of our criminal justice system in our society today. The courts, we have some major players in the courts are the prosecutors and then the judges and magistrates. So the prosecutors are responsible for filing charges. They seek indictments. If your state uses an indictment system, they're also involved in dismissing charges if they deem necessary, or they can reduce charges. Judges, on the other hand, set bail or conditions of release, accept pleas, determine delinquency. Delinquency is another word for juveniles in terms of committing crime. They can dismiss charges, impose sentence, revoke probation. So they have an array of other responsibilities. The corrections officials, they assign convicted prisoners to the type of correctional facility and oversee their imprisonment, award privileges for imprisoned inmates, so in other words, good time. When we say they assign convicted prisoners, most states have a system in which prisoners receive some type of diagnostic screening to determine which of their institutions is best fit for this particular inmate. We have parole, probation. They determine the date and conditions of parole or probation. They can revoke parole and probation. Supervised inmates released from incarceration on parole and probation. So they're supervising inmates who have either been released from prison or who are on probation in lieu of going to jail, or have done some jail time and then are placed on probation. So all of these type of systems, whether it's police, courts, or corrections, have all type of job opportunities. So they're essential in our system of justice. And the system of justice isn't going to disappear overnight. So there are job opportunities here. So whatever your interests are. Most of these are going to require some level of college. Most of these are going to require that you have good written skills, and some are going to require that you have good verbal communication skills. So as you think about your jobs, understand that in the criminal justice system, we do an awful lot of writing, right? Awful lot of writing. So when you're looking at the foundations, the fundamentals of the criminal justice process, in other words, how it works, here's a little schematic for us. You enter into the system by the police, prosecution and pretrial services, adjudication, meaning something happens to you, either found guilty or not guilty or plead guilty. Then we go into sentencing and sanctions, where the court has to determine what type of punishment to give you. And then the corrections are those members of the criminal justice system who, make sure you do your sentence or your punishment. Okay, so it's a 5 systems, it's 5-step process, 5-stage process that we go through here. So just make sure you're familiar with that. And the way that works is you enter into the system generally because the police detect a crime, which can both involve the police officer sees something, or it can involve the public that reports something. And then ultimately you're arrested and you're booked into jail for the alleged violation. Then the DA's office or the prosecutor's office has to determine how to charge you, what type of offenses to charge you with. That's their process. So they're responsible for making sure that takes place. So they file information or an indictment depending on how that is. And those are going to be the specific charges against that specific individual. Arraignment, again, that's a court process where you identify yourself, you're informed of the charges, and those type of things. So that's a very early on process in the criminal justice system. Adjudication, that's determined through trial or plea bargaining or dismissal of charges. So generally speaking, if you go to court and you want to claim your innocence, you go to trial and the jury determines your guilt or innocence, or you can plead guilty, right? Part of the plea bargaining process. Maybe you decide that that's more worth your time. Sentencing and sanctions, those are given out by the court, depending on the seriousness of your offense. And then corrections is responsible for carrying out those sanctions. Okay, so those are the 3 key parts of the criminal justice system. The last thing I want to touch on real quickly is one of the things you have to determine this week is whether or not the criminal justice system is a non-system or system. In other words, do we work together? So the question is criminal justice in the U.S. a system or a non-system? Critics say it's a non-system. Not all people believe it's a non-system, but if people think it's a non-system, why? So are the components, police, courts, and corrections of the criminal justice system independent bodies? These are just things for you to consider. Where do the components get their authority and budgets? How are the components different? Are the priorities of the police, courts, and corrections the same, or are they different? How and why? So as you think about the questions this week on the discussion thread about the criminal justice system and whether or not we work together and how we don't work together, think about these couple of questions as you answer that. And then think real hard, because I think you can all come up with ways in which we are not a system, okay? In other words, the priorities of the police may be different than the priorities of the courts, or the priorities of the corrections may be different than the priorities of the courts. How? Can you explain that? Can you give an example? Okay? So this is just a quick lecture. Feel free to look at the slides again. I know on some of these we move rather quick, but I don't want to take a whole lot of your time. But I do want to make sure you understand the key components of the criminal justice system. And this week especially, when you look at the criminal justice system as a system or non-system. Okay? If you have any more questions, or if any of this needs to be further explained to you, let me know. Thank you.